Phoenix, Arizona, the spring of 1965. A Tuesday morning in the business office of St. Joseph's Hospital on 3rd Avenue, 4 blocks from the Arizona state capitol. In the kind of office that hospital business departments occupied in that era, a room with a service counter along one wall and a row of chairs along the other, and a window that looked not outward but inward, toward the corridor. The specific design of a room that is intended to be found rather than sought, to be available to the people who need it without advertising itself to the people who are trying to ignore the fact that they need it. The hospital had been serving Phoenix since 1895, which meant it had been there before Arizona was a state and before Phoenix was a city, in the sense that cities are cities when they have the critical mass of people and institutions that makes them self-sustaining. It had been there through the heat and the growth and the specific transformation of a Sonoran desert town into a modern American city, and it had served the people of Phoenix through all of it with the specific institutional constancy of a place that has decided what it is for and has not deviated from that decision in 70 years, and had, in the 70 years since its founding, developed the specific institutional character of a hospital that has been part of a city long enough to have seen the city grow up around it, the character of an institution that is older than most of the buildings in its neighborhood, and that carries that age in the particular way that serious institutions carry it, as a form of reliability rather than a form of age. The business office opened at 8 in the morning. By 9:15, which was the time that the woman at the service counter noted in her log when the specific event she would later describe to her colleagues occurred, the chairs along the opposite wall held 4 people. A man in his 60s with a work shirt and the hands of someone who had spent his life in outdoor labor. A young woman with a folder of papers on her lap and the specific expression of someone who has rehearsed what she is going to say and is waiting for the opportunity to say it. A woman in her 40s in a housekeeper's uniform who had come in on her break and had a form to submit and a question to ask. And a man who had been sitting in the 4th chair from the door since 8:45 and who had not been called to the counter yet and who was reading a newspaper with the specific self-contained patience of a man who is accustomed to waiting and has made his peace with the waiting before it begins. The woman with the folder of papers was named Patricia Solis. She was 27 years old. She had been a nurse's aide at St. Joseph's for 3 years and had, in those 3 years, developed the specific relationship with the hospital's financial systems that people who work within institutions develop when they have reason to interact with those systems from both the inside and the outside. From the inside, as an employee, she understood how the billing worked and why it worked the way it did, and what the options were for people who could not pay what the billing required. From the outside, as the person responsible for the bills of her mother, who was 61 years old and had been living in Phoenix since 1948, and had worked in a laundry on Van Buren Street for 12 years and had retired from the laundry 3 years ago, on a retirement that was adequate in the way that things are adequate when they were built for one set of circumstances and are now operating in a different set. She was in the process of discovering that understanding how a system works is not the same as being able to navigate it successfully when the amounts involved exceed what navigation can reach. She was in the process of discovering that understanding how a system works is not the same as being able to navigate it successfully when the amounts involved exceed what navigation can reach. Her mother had been a patient at St. Joseph's for 11 days. She had had a procedure that had been necessary in the way that some procedures are necessary, which is that not having it would have produced an outcome worse than having it, and the having of it had produced a bill that Patricia Solis had been looking at for a week, and that she was now in the business office to discuss, with the specific combination of preparation and dread that characterizes discussions about bills that are larger than what is available to pay them. She had organized the papers in the folder in the order that made sense to her, which was the order in which she expected the conversation to require them. The insurance explanation of benefits first, because that established what had been covered. The financial assistance application second, because that was what she was there to submit. The income documentation third, because that was what the application required. The paper with the gap on it last, because the gap was the number the conversation would end on, and she wanted to be holding it when the conversation arrived there, as though holding it would make it different than it was, which she knew it would not, but which felt, nonetheless, like a form of preparation and the documentation of her mother's income and her own income, and the number that represented the gap between what was covered and what remained. The gap was a number that she had looked at many times in the past week, and that had not changed in the looking. The man in the fourth chair was 57 years old. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and 255 pounds, and he was in Phoenix because he had been in Tucson the previous day for a meeting and had driven north on the interstate and had stopped in Phoenix because he had a friend who lived in Phoenix whom he had not seen in 2 years and who had been ill and whom he intended to visit that afternoon. He was at St. Joseph's that morning because the friend he was going to visit was a patient there, on the 3rd floor, in a room that looked out toward the Estrella Mountains to the southwest, the mountains that Phoenix residents use as their west-facing landmark, the way that other desert cities use other mountains. He had intended to go directly to the 3rd floor when he arrived. He had arrived instead at the business office on the ground floor, which was not on the way to the 3rd floor, and which he had not planned to visit because he had seen, on his way through the main entrance and toward the elevator, a woman come through the door of the admissions area with a folder and an expression, and he had arrived early and had gone to the business office. Not because he had business there, but because he had seen a woman come through the door with a folder and a specific expression, and had followed the specific logic of a man who has learned, over many years, to pay attention to expressions on people's faces in public places, and to act on what those expressions tell him when the acting on them is possible. He had been in the 4th chair since 8:45. He had been reading the newspaper with the patience that the newspaper required, and the patience that the situation required, and had been listening, with the peripheral attention he brought to waiting rooms, to the conversation at the counter when Patricia Solis was called forward at 9:10. He had heard enough in the way that a man hears enough when he has been paying the specific kind of attention that waiting rooms produce in people who have learned to pay it, which is not the directed attention of someone who is trying to overhear, but the ambient attention of someone who is present to a space and receives what the space contains. He had heard enough. He had set the newspaper on the empty chair beside him and had looked at the counter, and at the woman at the counter, and at the folder under Patricia Solis's arm, and at the expression she was carrying, and had made the decision that the situation required making. He had waited while she finished at the counter. When she turned from the counter with the folder under her arm and the expression that people carry when a difficult conversation has been had, and the outcome was what they expected, and the expecting of it had not made it easier, He stood. He said, "Excuse me." She looked at him. He said that he hoped she would forgive the intrusion, and that he had overheard some of the conversation at the counter, and that he had a question. She looked at him for the moment of recognition that always required a moment and arrived in stages. The face first, and then the certainty of the face, and then the name behind the certainty. He said that he would like to help with the bill if she would allow it. He said it in the flat, direct tone he used for things he meant. He said that he understood if she preferred not to accept it, and that he would not press if she said no, and that the offer was simply there if she wanted it. Patricia Solis looked at him for a long moment. She was 27 years old and had been a nurse's aide for 3 years, and had spent those 3 years in a hospital, and had, in the course of those 3 years, seen the full range of what people did for each other in the specific circumstances that hospitals produced, from nothing to everything. She said yes. She did not say it. Immediately. There was a moment, a specific and real moment of the kind that people have when they are deciding something that they did not expect to be asked to decide, and that requires them to determine whether the thing being offered is something they can accept, and whether the accepting of it costs them something that matters. She determined these things in the moment, and arrived at her answer in the moment, and said it. She said yes. She said it in a voice that was not the voice of someone performing gratitude or surprise, but the voice of someone who has just been offered something they need and have decided to accept it with the directness the offer deserves. He nodded. He walked to the counter. He spoke to the woman at the counter for several minutes. The conversation at the counter lasted 11 minutes. Patricia Solis sat in the chairs and looked at the folder in her lap, and looked at the counter, and looked at the folder again. The conversation at the counter was quiet enough that she could hear the tone, but not the words. The tone was the tone of a transaction being conducted efficiently and without drama by two people who both understood what was happening and what the appropriate pace for it was. She could hear that it was a conversation being conducted with the quiet efficiency of someone who does transactions and knows how to do them, and is doing this one without any of the performance that transactions sometimes attract when they are unusual in size or character. When he came back from the counter, he said that it had been handled and that the woman at the counter would have the paperwork ready for her when she was called back. He said it simply. He picked up the newspaper from the empty chair. He said that he hoped her mother recovered well. He walked out of the business office and into the corridor, and was gone before she had found the words for what she wanted to say. The woman at the counter called Patricia Solis back at 9:32. She confirmed that the balance had been settled and explained what had been processed, and gave her the paperwork that documented the settlement. Patricia Solis looked at the paperwork. She looked at the amount on it. She was quiet for a moment. The woman at the counter said that the gentleman had asked that his name not be recorded on the settlement documents, and that the hospital had honored that request, and that the amount was reflected as an anonymous payment. Patricia Solis took the paperwork. She walked out of the business office and into the corridor. The corridor of St. Joseph's on a Tuesday morning in April was the corridor of a working hospital, the movement of nurses and orderlies, and the specific sounds of a medical institution conducting its morning business. She stood in it for a moment. The amount on the paperwork was an amount she had been looking at for a week, and that had not changed in the looking, and that was now settled. The man who had settled it had been sitting in the fourth chair from the door since 8:45 and had been reading a newspaper. She had not known he was there until he stood. She did not know how he had known to stand when he did. She did not know the full amount he had paid because the paperwork showed the settlement and not the breakdown of it. And she had not asked the woman at the counter for the breakdown. She knew the amount that had remained after insurance. She knew that amount was settled. The amount that remained after insurance was the amount that had been on her mind for a week. The amount she had calculated and recalculated and looked at from every angle that looking from angles could produce. The amount that had not changed in the looking and had not produced any solution in the recalculating. It was no longer on her mind. It was on the paperwork in her hand, marked settled, and her mind was therefore free of it for the first time in a week. She walked down the corridor toward the ward where her mother was. The corridor was the corridor it had always been. The same fluorescent lights and the same linoleum and the same sounds of a hospital morning. And it was also a different corridor than the one she had walked through 40 minutes earlier when she had come in from the parking lot with the folder under her arm and the amount on her mind. The difference was not in the corridor. It was in the thing she was carrying, which was no longer what she had been carrying when she came in, because the thing she had been carrying for a week was settled, and what she was carrying now was the paperwork that documented the settlement, and the specific bewildering lightness of a burden that has been lifted by someone who had no obligation to lift it, and who had asked for nothing in return except the permission to do it. Outside the hospital, the Phoenix morning continued in the ordinary way of Phoenix mornings in April, the specific dry, bright quality of the desert Southwest in spring, the light and the heat that was coming, and the air that was not yet entirely the air of summer, and was still, in the mornings, the air of a season that was passing. The man who had been in the fourth chair was in the parking lot. He got into his car. He drove to his friend's house in the neighborhood north of the hospital. He spent the afternoon with his friend. He did not mention the business office, or the woman with the folder, or the conversation at the counter. He drove back to Tucson that evening on the same interstate he had taken north the previous morning, the interstate that runs south through the desert between Phoenix and Tucson, through the flat Sonoran terrain that looks the same in both directions, and that at night is dark in the specific way of desert highway darkness, without the ambient light of cities to soften the edges of the road and the sky. He had spent the afternoon with his friend, and had eaten dinner with his friend's family, and had said goodbye at 7, and had been on the interstate by 7:30. He drove south. The desert was dark, and the road was straight, and the distance between the two cities was the same distance it had always been, and was covered at the pace that the interstate covered it, which was efficient and without drama, and produced, at the end of it, the specific ordinary arrival of a man returning to the city he had come from. The amount was never disclosed, not because there was a formal agreement that it would not be disclosed, but because the two people who knew it, the man who paid it, and the woman at the counter who processed it, had each understood, from the specific nature of the transaction, that disclosure was not what the transaction was for.